The room froze. Not because J.D. Vance had shouted, he hadn't. His voice was low, deliberate, soaked with confidence. "Bow before American power," he said, eyes fixed on Ibrahim Traoré like a general reminding a young soldier who wrote the rules. It was live television. A high-stakes international summit. Panelists from every continent, cameras streaming to millions. The topic, sovereignty in the 21st century. The setup was polite. The execution wasn't. Ibrahim Traoré didn't blink. He slowly stood, unbuttoned his dark jacket, and slid it off with a calmness that made the room more tense than any shout could. The silence was so thick, even the sound crew leaned in. One of the American aides reached for a mic switch, just in case. Traoré folded the jacket and placed it gently on his chair. Then he looked straight at Vance. "I've never bowed to a man," he said quietly, "and I won't start with a senator." The moderator stammered, unsure whether to intervene. But Traoré stepped forward, not with hostility, but with an air that reminded everyone in the room, this man had seen war. This man had buried friends. And he didn't come here to kneel. Vance forced a chuckle. "You came to this forum, didn't you? To this table. That's already a kind of bow." Traoré tilted his head slightly, like a lion assessing a trespasser. "I came," he said, "because every empire falls twice. Once when it collapses. Once when it forgets why it rose." The moderator gasped. The room stirred. From the American delegation's side, you could feel the discomfort, sharp, visible. Some exchanged glances. Others typed hastily into phones. But Vance leaned in. "Are you threatening the United States?" "I'm warning it," Traoré answered. "The last time someone tried to force my people to bow, they left behind monuments of failure." There was a pause. Heavy. Uncomfortable. But electric. Then Vance smiled coldly. "You talk big for someone who survives off American aid." Traoré's answer came like iron, "We survived despite it." At that moment, the dynamic shifted. This wasn't just a debate. It was something older. Something deeper. A duel of ideologies, steel-cloaked in suits and studio lights. And neither man had any intention of backing down. Traoré's reply didn't just silence the room, it echoed far beyond it. Within minutes, clips of the exchange between him and J.D. Vance lit up social media like wildfire. The line, "We survived despite it," was clipped, captioned, and translated into 10 languages before the debate even ended. But inside the studio, the tension only thickened. J.D. Vance leaned back slightly, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. "Do you know what happens to countries that bite the hand that feeds them?" he asked, voice sharp. Traoré didn't move. "I do. But I also know what happens when the hand becomes a fist." That line hit harder than expected. Several panelists shifted in their seats. A European diplomat coughed awkwardly. A tech entrepreneur from California looked at the floor. But the American audience? Divided. Some leaned forward, fascinated. Others visibly fumed. Vance adjusted his tie and went in for the kill. "You speak of dignity. Of sovereignty," he said, his southern drawl becoming more pointed. "Yet you stand here in a Western suit, on a Western platform, speaking a Western language, because your systems failed to produce one of their own." Gasps. Even the moderator, who'd promised neutrality, winced. Traoré didn't flinch. "Our systems didn't fail," he said calmly. "They were dismantled. Brick by brick. Sanction by sanction. Assassination by assassination. And now, you call the ashes failure and pretend you weren't the fire." Silence again. But this time, Vance didn't smile. For a brief second, something behind his eyes shifted, irritation, maybe even doubt, but he buried it quickly under political instinct. History's complicated, he muttered. History is written by the ones who don't flinch when men like you raise your voices, Traoré replied, walking back to his seat. The moderator tried to redirect, talk of climate partnerships, digital infrastructure, investment deals, but no one cared anymore. The center of gravity had moved. This was no longer about policy. It was about dominance. The control of narrative. The ownership of truth. And while Vance had the platform, the resources, and the American flag behind him, Traoré had something else, something older than empire and louder than applause. Conviction. And conviction, when spoken plainly, does something dangerous. It makes people listen. The studio lights burned on, but all anyone could see now was the space between the two men. It wasn't a stage, it had become a battleground. The moderator attempted to move forward with scripted questions, but no one was listening. Because Traoré wasn't done. He leaned into the mic with a calmness that felt rehearsed, but wasn't. What men like Senator Vance want, he said, turning slightly to the audience, is not partnership. Not cooperation. They want obedience. He paused. I didn't come with obedience. I came with memory. The air thickened. Memory, Traoré continued, of coups backed in silence. Of leaders assassinated for dreaming too loudly. Of contracts signed in English that emptied lands in languages you never bothered to learn. J.D. Vance shifted, irritated but composed. So it's America's fault, again. Everything. Always. No, Traoré replied instantly. But you've made yourselves the axis. When you claim to be the center of the world, don't be surprised when blame points at you from every direction. The line drew a slow murmur from the international audience. Vance leaned forward. And what's your solution, then? Another resistance fantasy? Shouting on global stages while your people beg for vaccines and electricity? This time, Traoré didn't even respond immediately. He looked at the American senator like one might look at a child repeating words he doesn't understand. My people do not beg, he said finally. They build. And they bleed. You're still reliant on us, Vance shot back. Then withdraw. Stop the aid. Stop the influence. Stop the weapons. Let the world see who needs whom. A hush spread across the room. No one was prepared for that kind of offer. Not even the Americans. For a long moment, even Vance had no comeback. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched the sides of his chair, just for a second. Traoré, sensing the opening, delivered the final blow of the round. America teaches the world to depend, then calls them weak for needing help. That's not power. That's manipulation. Cameras flashed. Journalists typed furiously. Even the tech crew was stunned into silence. And somewhere in the back, a young African delegate whispered to her colleague. He's not just answering. He's rewriting the debate. J.D. Vance straightened in his chair. He knew the cameras were still rolling. Every gesture mattered. Every micro-expression would be clipped, looped, and analyzed. He reached for his water, took a slow sip, and exhaled. Then he fired back. You speak as if America is the villain of history, he said, his voice steady but colder. But we've built roads where there was nothing. We've brought medicine, electricity, security. And debt, Traoré cut in, without raising his voice. Don't forget the debt. Vance's smile flickered. That's the cost of civilization. Traoré didn't blink. To whom? A ripple moved through the room. But Traoré leaned forward now, not to argue, but to reveal. I come from a land that knows collapse, he said. We've seen systems fall. Colonies crumble. Empires rot from the inside. We don't fear collapse, Senator. He locked eyes with Vance. We've survived yours before. The audience reacted, not with applause, but with something deeper: stillness. That kind of silence only emerges when people are confronted with something they weren't ready to hear. Vance leaned back. "You sound proud of pain." "No," Traoré replied. "I'm proud that we didn't vanish." He turned slightly toward the broader panel. "The mistake Western power makes, again and again, is believing suffering breaks people. But suffering teaches. It stores memory. It creates leaders with spines." The moderator tried, once again, to redirect. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could refocus on development." But no one cared. Traoré kept going. "You lecture us about infrastructure. But you forget, we had systems before you drew our borders. Languages before your treaties. Trade before your discovery." He looked at Vance again. "We didn't appear when you arrived. We endured when you left." That line hit like a drum. J.D. Vance's expression turned more rigid now. Still composed, but unmistakably annoyed. He checked his notes, a subtle cue to change direction. But Traoré had already seized the narrative. And the audience, international, skeptical, hungry for truth, leaned his way. Because something was happening that couldn't be rehearsed. A senator had come expecting applause. A captain had arrived carrying scars. And it was no longer clear who the world was listening to. The moderator, now visibly nervous, glanced at the clock. What was supposed to be a diplomatic roundtable had turned into something else entirely. Cameras zoomed in. Editors whispered to producers backstage. But no one dared interrupt. J.D. Vance finally spoke, slower this time. More measured. "You speak of survival, Mr. Traoré. But survival is not success. Look around you. Your region struggles with instability, insurgency, poverty. Meanwhile, America spends trillions bombing the same deserts it then offers to rebuild," Traoré interrupted. Vance's jaw clenched. "You confuse opposition with hostility," Traoré added, leaning in now. "You think because we don't clap, we must be broken. But you're mistaking silence for consent." The line struck a nerve. Not just with Vance, but with delegates across the stage. A Latin American minister nodded quietly. An Eastern European diplomat raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Traoré continued. "Our silence has been misunderstood for too long. We were silent when our leaders were overthrown. Silent when our lands were carved up by corporations. Silent when media called us failed states while your tanks guarded our oil fields." He stood up again, not dramatically, but with purpose. The room didn't stop him. "We were silent because the microphone was never ours. But now." He gestured to the camera. "Now it is." Vance tried to cut in. "Are you suggesting America is an oppressor?" "I'm saying," Traoré replied, "that your system depends on obedience dressed as diplomacy." He turned to the panel. "You call it partnership when we agree. You call it instability when we don't. That's not freedom. That's conditioning." The American delegation shifted uncomfortably. One aide whispered something into Vance's ear. But Vance waved it off. He was locked in now, too proud to back down. "So what do you propose?" Vance asked tightly. "That the world should abandon the U.S. and follow your example?" "No," said Traoré calmly. "I'm proposing that the world stop following anyone." Another silence. This one hit different. Because in that moment, Traoré wasn't just representing his nation. He was voicing something others had whispered in corridors, written in cautious articles, but never dared say aloud in front of an American senator. The illusion of consensus was breaking. And Traoré was standing where few ever had, unchained, unafraid, and undeniably heard. By now, the stage was no longer a debate, it was a reckoning. The moderator had given up on control. The camera angles changed subtly, centering Traoré now as much as Vance. Online viewership spiked. Comment sections burned with both admiration and outrage. And J.D. Vance? He wasn't backing down either. "Let's be clear," he said, tone tightening. "Without American leadership, the world would spiral into chaos. Our strength keeps balance. Our economy lifts others. Our military prevents worse actors from taking the stage." Traoré raised his eyebrows, then slowly walked toward the edge of the platform, facing the audience, not the senator. "You don't lead the world," he said. "You police it." He let the line hang. Vance interrupted, "And what's wrong with that, if it keeps the peace?" Traoré turned his head back to him. "Peace is not the absence of bombs. Peace is the presence of justice." There was a sound, low, almost involuntary. A murmur from someone in the audience. Maybe agreement. Maybe disbelief. But no one spoke over him. "You enforce your order," Traoré said, "with sanctions that starve children and drones that don't ask questions. You tell the world it's free, then punish it for acting like it." Vance folded his arms. "That's a convenient story. But the truth is, countries line up to trade with us. To ally with us. You're not rejecting the system. You're just mad you're not sitting at the head of the table." Traoré smiled. "I'm saying it's time we built a new table." The room shifted again. Because in that moment, Traoré wasn't making a complaint, he was making a proposal. "We don't want to replace your empire," he continued. "We want to outgrow it. Not through war. Not through violence. But through dignity, self-reliance, and memory." A slow silence took root again, deep, respectful, uncertain. "You have aircraft carriers," he said. "We have vision." Vance exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly irritated. "Vision doesn't stop tanks." "Neither does fear," Traoré answered. Now even the moderator looked stunned. Not because Traoré had humiliated Vance, he hadn't. But because he'd offered something rare in these rooms. A future that didn't orbit Washington. And that terrified some people more than any threat ever could. J.D. Vance adjusted his seat, the air heavy with defiance. He wasn't used to being challenged this directly, especially not by someone who, in his mind, represented a region that should be grateful for America's involvement. "I get it," he said finally. "You want respect. You want sovereignty. Every country does. But there's a difference between pride and practicality. Without American support, your nations would fall into darkness." Traoré didn't laugh. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "We already fell into darkness. And we learned how to see in it." That line quieted even Vance. Then Traoré walked closer. "Not as a threat, but as a presence. You think we want your seat," he said softly. "But we don't want your throne. We want our voice back." The audience leaned in. "We want our systems, not your approvals. Our leaders, not your puppets. Our futures, not your blueprints. And we want our people to stop being told that dignity must come stamped with your flag." Vance frowned. "You're oversimplifying global complexity. There are rules. There are partnerships." "No," Traoré said sharply. "There are hierarchies. Built by fear. Enforced by loans. Protected by media. And every time one of us questions that order, you call us rebels, radicals, or worse, ungrateful." Now the audience murmured again, some uneasy, some empowered. Traoré turned to the crowd. "Let me ask you all something. What do you call a system where the powerful write the rules, enforce the rules, judge the rules, and punish the ones who resist them?" He paused. "In any other context, we'd call it a dictatorship." The moderator's face went pale. Vance's expression hardened. Are you accusing the United States of being a global dictator? He asked, his voice sharp. I'm saying the world deserves to vote, Traoré replied. Not just in elections, but in how global power is shaped. And right now, that vote doesn't exist. It's bought, bullied, or bombed. The room fell still once more. This wasn't a rant. It was a revolution, spoken sentence by sentence, calmly, methodically, and with the kind of clarity that didn't need to shout. And as the lights burned above and the world watched on screens from Washington to Johannesburg, something became crystal clear. Traoré wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to end a pattern. J.D. Vance leaned forward now, no longer smiling. The gloves were off. He tapped the desk once and narrowed his eyes. You talk about rewriting global power, he said. But let's be real. Without the US, half the world would be under Chinese or Russian boots. We've kept the peace. Traoré turned toward him slowly. No, he said. You've kept the order. There's a difference. The audience stiffened. Vance exhaled sharply. So who do you think would do better? You? With what army? What economy? What system? Traoré didn't even flinch. I'm not trying to replace the empire, he said. I'm trying to remove the need for one. Vance chuckled bitterly. That's idealism. Traoré nodded. Maybe. But every empire ends. Every idea, no matter how invincible it seems, eventually collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy. He took a step forward, eyes locked on Vance. You claim to protect freedom. But if freedom has to be approved, it isn't freedom. If it needs a signature from Washington, it's a license. If it disappears when someone disagrees with you, it's a contract. Now it was the American audience that shifted uncomfortably. And if I'm allowed to speak, Traoré said, only because I'm not a threat, then I'm not actually free. I'm tolerated. And tolerance is not the same thing as equality. Vance tried to pivot. So you'd rather reject progress just to prove a point? I'd rather walk barefoot with dignity, Traoré said, than ride a limousine with a leash. The moderator raised his hand, sensing a volatile peak, but even he looked unsure whether stopping them now would help or backfire. The room was on edge, suspended in that rarest of moments, when truth, power, and politics collided without a script. Vance leaned back again, visibly rattled now. You're romanticizing the past. I'm remembering it, Traoré said. Because if we don't remember, we'll repeat it. And this time, we won't survive it. A long pause followed. No applause. No sound. Just two men sitting at a table where only one seemed fully awake to the weight of history crashing down between them. And somewhere beyond the stage, millions watching began to ask a question they'd never dared ask before. What if the world didn't need a master? The studio air had shifted. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was transformation. Something irreversible was happening. In real time. On live television. And J.D. Vance felt it. He reached for composure, grasping at policy language like a lifeline. Let's be practical, he said. Without order, American order, the world slips into chaos. Traoré didn't sit back. He stood. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was controlled, low, but it echoed like a verdict. You call it chaos, he said. We call it awakening. The audience didn't move. Even the American delegation, once dominant in posture and presence, seemed frozen in their seats. You've mistaken global silence for satisfaction, Traoré continued. But it was grief. Fatigue. The kind that comes when your history is rewritten, your voice edited, your pain politely ignored. He stepped closer to the center. You told us who our heroes should be. What progress should look like. Which suits to wear. Which flags to salute? Then he paused. But we remember. He turned his head slowly, scanning the international faces across the panel. We remember what it cost to keep your systems running. The minerals pulled from our ground. The sun sent to your wars. The leaders we lost. The culture we were told to clean. The moderator tried to reassert control. President Traoré, we are almost out of time, but the room wasn't his anymore. Traoré kept speaking. You say you lead the free world. But leadership isn't measured by power. It's measured by who listens when you speak, and who speaks when you stop. He looked directly at Vance again. And tonight, Senator, I spoke. Vance inhaled sharply. You think speeches change systems? Traoré nodded. No. But they start fires. And fires change everything. The camera lights caught something unusual then, not rage, not triumph, but a flicker of fear behind Vance's eyes. The fear of a man who realizes the ground beneath him is no longer solid. That the applause he counted on is being rerouted. That control isn't permanent. And for the first time, it became clear. This wasn't just a clash of men. It was the sound of old walls cracking. And the sound that followed was not chaos. It was freedom, finally learning to speak. As the moderator finally thanked the panelists, his voice cracked slightly, not from emotion, but from pressure. He could feel it. Everyone could. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The closing statement was meant to come from J.D. Vance. As the highest-ranking American official present, protocol dictated he offer final remarks. But as the moderator turned toward him, Vance held up a hand, just slightly. He knew it was over. Traoré stepped back from the center, adjusted his sleeves, and picked up the jacket he had removed when the debate began. The same symbolic gesture that had shifted the energy in the first place. But he didn't put it on. He simply folded it, held it by his side, and looked out across the room, at the diplomats, the analysts, the aides, the students, the journalists. All frozen. Then something happened. Not applause. Not cheers. Not protocol. People began to stand. One by one. Quietly. Respectfully. They didn't rise for drama. They rose because something inside them recognized that a threshold had been crossed. That a man had walked into a room built to control voices, and refused to echo back what was expected of him. Traoré didn't bow. He didn't wave. He simply nodded. And turned to leave. Behind him, Vance remained seated, stiff. The camera lingered on him for a moment too long, just enough to capture the look of a man who had come to dominate, but instead had been outmaneuvered not by power, but by truth. Outside, protesters and supporters clashed over screens, soundbites, and interpretations. Some called Traoré arrogant. Others called him brave. Headlines split down ideological lines. But inside the room, one thing was undeniable. A shift had taken place. Not a revolution. Not yet. But the seed of one. And as Traoré stepped into the hallway, flanked by no security detail, no prepared statement, no teleprompter, a young journalist caught up to him and asked breathlessly. Mr. President, do you really believe America's time is over? Traoré stopped. Then answered with the same quiet force he had used all night. No. But I believe their time as unquestioned rulers is. And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind not just a debate, but a wound in the armor of American dominance. And the unmistakable echo of something new beginning. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. J.D. Vance spoke the language of power. Traoré answered with the weight of memory. And when it ended, the room didn't clap. It stood still. Because something unspoken had shifted. The rules weren't broken, they were exposed. Maybe the world hasn't changed yet. But after this, no one can pretend it won't. Warning: this video is a work of fiction. It does not depict real events or real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. If you believe some questions deserve to be asked again, backhand index pointing right, subscribe. Share. Speak up.